So I am an ecologist, and I'm interested in the idea of the biodiversity that we observe in the world. So we observe very many species, very much variation within the species, between species, and these species are not isolated, but rather they depend on each other, and they form these networks of interactions. For example, this is what Jennifer would call third generation data. This is a sketch of the food web of the WebSci ecosystem, and these represent who is whom in this ecosystem. And so today I would like to talk about two problems. One is some work that I did with my student, Si Tang, that was recently published, and it has to do with the stability of ecological networks. And this is truly a classic in theoretical ecology. So I will give you a brief overview of what the problem is and what we try to do with this problem. So imagine that we have species, right? I will always say species for xi, but you, coming from different field, can imagine being anything else that can be described by a system of differential equations. And so when these differential equations represent the growth of a species, the equation includes some other species. For example, the growth rate of a given species will go up when their prey go up, and will go down when predators go up, right? And so this is a dynamical system, and the least dynamical approach we can take for a dynamical system is to study their equilibria. So points where the density of the species are such that the growth rate of each and every species is 0 when this is maintained. And when we have an equilibrium, we can classify the equilibrium as stable or unstable. And to do so, we make use of this Jacobian matrix that is basically the tangent of the system at any point, right? It's a matrix of slopes. And then we can substitute our equilibrium points in the matrix. We get a matrix of numbers. And it turns out that the eigenvalues of these matrix determine the stability of the system. So if all the eigenvalues have negative real part, then the system is stable at this point, at this equilibrium point. If any of the eigenvalue has a positive real part, then the ecosystem is unstable at this particular point. And we care about stability because that tells us if the system is going to recover from small perturbations. So here we have a stable system. We perturb it slightly. This only holds for infinitesimal perturbations. And you can see the density of each species goes back to where it was before. And this we have the same perturbation, but on an unstable system. And you can see species tend to oscillate. Oscillation grow in time, and eventually they can lead to the loss of species. Right? So now, with this background, we can talk about the work Robert May did in 1972. Very influential paper, very short paper. And he started modeling directly this community metric. So it's very difficult to go from the general form of the equations, find equilibria, and then compute the stability of this equilibrium. He just said, well, let's start directly from the matrix that determines whether an equilibrium is stable or not, and he calls this matrix M. This matrix contains S columns and S rows. These are the species in the system. Each two species can interact with each other, so it's a network. And they interact with each other with probability C, and the type of interaction between the two species is drawn at random. And then for simplicity, we assume that each species, if it were isolated from the system, it would not grow to infinite numbers or go extinct by itself. So there's some sort of self-regulation. In ecology, we can think of this as a logistic growth or other forms of density dependence. And so this algorithm can be used to build. It's a recipe to build matrices, right? So we take a matrix that is initially empty, and then we put something on the diagonal for this density dependence, and we will call this minus d, and we assume that this is either all of them are minus d or on average are minus d with small variance. And then we can go on through the off-diagonal coefficients in the matrix, and then draw a random number, decides whether we have an interaction. And if we have an interaction with probability C, we draw it from a normal distribution, for example, right? We mean 0 and standard deviation sigma. And then we represent, for example, plus would be represented in red, negative numbers in green. Right? So for this matrix, May show that there's a critical quantity, the square root of the number of species times the probability of interaction between any two species that determines the stability of the system. And we have what physicists would call the phase transition. So here we have a probability of stability close to 1. When we cross this threshold, then the probability of stability goes to 0 very rapidly. Okay. Why was this paper so influential? Because it tells us, well, go in nature, you find very many species. These species are interacting with each other in these very complex networks. But unfortunately, this should not exist, right? It should not be able to maintain the system through time because it's very complex and it's very large. And so May mused that nature must adopt some devious strategies to maintain biodiversity in the face of these very beautiful mathematical results. And ecologists for 40 years started looking for these devious strategies, and we have a whole list of stabilizing or destabilizing mechanisms that have been proposed in the literature. So now I want to show you that May could not really prove his statement, although the statement is correct. In fact, to prove this statement, you need this result from Girkos that was published in 1984. And this describes the eigenvalue distribution for very large matrices. In the limit of S that goes to infinity, we have a matrix in which each coefficient is independent and identically distributed with mean 0 and variance 1. Then the eigenvalues of a normalized matrix are contained in a unit circle. And you can see that when you increase the size of the matrix, this unit circle with uniform distribution of eigenvalues becomes better and better. Right? So they weakly converge to this result. And so now we can use this result to actually show that May is right. So in May's matrices, we have a circle, right, that is centered at minus d0. That's like the diagonal effect. And then the horizontal radius of this circle is S times the variance of the matrix under the square root. You work out your algebra, and in fact, you find exactly this, sigma square root of SC. So for stability, you remember all the eigenvalues must be contained in the left half plane, which means that the radius must be smaller than d, and that's our stability criterion. And because if you multiply the whole matrix by 20, for example, then you get d becomes 20 times larger, and each coefficient becomes 20 times larger. This doesn't alter the stability of the system. It's like measuring things in grams versus kilograms. And so all we care is the ratio between d and sigma, and we will call this theta. And so this is a May stability criterion. The point is that May's matrices are random. And so when we think of a random matrix, we think, oh, this can take any value, right? It could build any network. But in fact, because we're talking about the limit of S large, then we have a not so random matrix after all. For example, what is the fraction of things not interacting with each other, right? Say we have two species, we want to draw the probability of having 0 and 0. Well, we will have 0 with probability 1 minus c, then we have to sample another 0 that is going to be 1 minus c squared. Same way, the probability of having a mutualistic interaction plus two species helping each other out is going to be C probability of getting an interaction, 50% probability of getting a plus, C probability of getting the other interaction, 50% of getting the other plus. So when we're talking for large S, this is a very precise matrix type, right, that will reproduce pretty much exactly these frequencies. So what C and I wanted to do is like to decouple these quantities and study limiting cases. What happens if all the interactions are of the predator-prey type, say plus and minus, consumer and resource, or all of them are plus plus or minus minus. And so we can build slightly different matrices. In a predator-prey matrix, it's exactly like May's, but now we sample couples of coefficients. We sample the effect of the prey on the predator and the predator on the prey. We can either set them both to 0, or take one from a positive distribution and the other one from a negative distribution. So you can see that for each plus, there's a corresponding minus, and for each minus, there is a corresponding plus, right? Or we can do couple pluses with pluses and minuses with minuses, and we can do this sort of mixture of 50% competitive interactions, 50% mutualistic interactions. Right. The problem is that now we cannot use Girkos' law anymore because these are not IID variables, right? We introduce some sort of covariance because we couple the signs. But it turns out that there's an elliptical law, that's how I call it, that was published in 1988 in the realm of quantum physics by Summers and these collaborators. And so this shows that the fundamental quantity is this correlation between the effect of one species on the other, I on J, J on I, right? If we multiply these two things, we get the expectation. This we will call tau, right? So when tau is negative, instead of having a circle, we have a vertically stretched ellipse. When tau is 0, of course, these become IID, and we recover the circle of Gierko's circular law. When these two, when tau is positive, we have a horizontally stretched ellipse. And so we can use this result to derive the criteria for matrices that are non-random in the sense May had. And so we can do this with predator-prey. Now, in the limit of S large, we have a vertically stretched ellipse because we know that the effect of one species I on J, if that's positive, then the effect of J on I is negative. So their product is always going to be negative, and therefore tau is going to be negative. And so what happens is that we can write down analytically a stability criterion that is very similar to that of May, right? But now we have this extra part, 1 minus delta square, where delta is a shape parameter. It tells us the shape of the distribution of interaction strengths. And I will return on this later. And now it's very easy also to do the case where we have pluses with pluses and minuses with minuses, because the only thing that changes is that now this tau is always going to be positive, so we're always going to get a horizontally stretched ellipse. And also here you can imagine to stabilize this horizontally stretched ellipse, we have to move the center much to the left. So while the circle is in an intermediate case, then the vertically stretched ellipse is easier to stabilize. The horizontally stretched ellipse is more difficult to stabilize. And all that changes is this that was a minus for the predator-prey case, now is a plus. Okay? So this is just to recap. When tau is negative, vertically stretched ellipse, predator-prey interaction, easy to stabilize. When tau is 0, circle, intermediate between the two cases. And when tau becomes positive, then we have the horizontal stretched ellipse, more difficult to stabilize. These are all cases that have a sort of a mean 0 for the off-diagonal coefficients, because we always sample either the pluses from the absolute value of some distribution and the minuses from minus the absolute value of a distribution. And of course, in ecology, we're also interested in purely positive or purely negative interactions. For example, just competition, just mutualism. Turns out that with some algebra massage, you can do the same analytical work on these other cases. And this figure summarizes our findings. So for a given delta over sigma, this is like what I was calling theta before. Then we have that mutualism plus plus, competition minus minus, or the mixture of the two, they're all clustered around here. So it says that this area is where the system is stable. As soon as you either increase the number of species or increase the connections, you get into the unstable part of the system. And then we have random matrices studied by May that are in red here. And you can see predator-preys are much more stable than you would expect from May's result. So now I want just to say something on these distribution shapes, right? So we took like this as some sort of reflected gamma distribution. And this is flexible enough that we can have two distributions that have the same mean, 0, the same variance, sigma squared, but they have very different shapes. In one case, we have a lot of the density close to 0. So we call this distribution that has very many weak interactions. And this, we basically carved out the density around 0 such that now we have very strong interactions. What is the effect on the circle? None. That's really mind-boggling. But it has been proved recently by Terry Tao and his collaborators that under very, very mild condition, any distribution with the same mean and same variance will give you exactly the same result. That's not the story, however, when it comes down to predator-prey interactions. So when we have the weak interactions being prevalent, you can see we have a fat ellipse. Right? A fat ellipse is bad for stabilization because we have to move the whole ellipse to the left, right, to stabilize it. While when we don't have the weak interaction, we have on average stronger interactions, this ellipse becomes thinner and therefore easier to stabilize. As you can imagine, if you follow this far, the opposite happens when we have a mixture of competition and mutualism or competition in isolation, where a fat ellipse is easier to stabilize and a skinny ellipse is more difficult to stabilize. So what I'm very interested in, that's almost as far as we got in this paper, but what I'm very interested in is, okay, these are in a way some sort of Erdo-Chernyi random graphs. There's really no structure in these networks. So we try to plug in, instead of having an unstructured predator-prey interaction, what if we use some of these models Jennifer was talking about that try to build more and more realistic food web structures, right? So we use two, and what you find is that these structures throw out eigenvalues from the theoretical ellipse on the right and on the left, and therefore, this makes the system less stable, right? So I report here in blue the transition if we had an unstructured predator-prey case, and you can see that the phase transition happens earlier under the cascade model, and even earlier using the niche model. That's really bizarre, because that should be a better model for food web structure. So this is the area of research we're very interested in right now. So just to summarize very briefly what I just showed you, I just showed that you can extend this very beautiful criteria of May. Instead of having just purely random metrics, we can introduce some structure in the sense of coupling the signs of the coefficients, right? Pluses with pluses, minuses with minuses, pluses with minuses. And then there's a strict hierarchy. So for stabilization, we go from the most difficult to stabilize are competition, mutualism, and their mixture. And then we move to random case, and then much easier to stabilize the predator-prey case. The predator-prey case is, in fact, qualitatively different. So I just show you that when you crank up the interaction strengths, the ellipse becomes thinner and thinner. And this means that by just altering the interaction strength distribution, you can support an infinite number of species. So after all, wherever we look, there's things consuming each other. Like these predator-prey interactions are very, very prevalent in nature. And so maybe, after all, we don't really need devious strategies to explain how these networks can coexist through time. And so this goes back to the idea of that weak interactions are destabilizing for predator-prey systems. And that's going a bit against the grain of what ecologists thought until very recently, because there's papers saying exactly the opposite in very prominent journals, but it follows directly from the derivation. And then these are stabilizing for mutualism and competition. They have no effect on random networks. And this last puzzling result, the idea that realistic structures are destabilizing, is the focus of what we're doing right now. And what we're trying to do is, okay, in this paper, we assume the pluses to be on average as strong as the minuses, but that's not what happens in nature, right? The positive effect of a prey on a predator is typically much smaller than the negative effect of the predator on the prey. You can imagine the prey dies, the predator gets some calories, right? So when you embed this asymmetry in the distribution, then you can show that these networks that have more structure can, in fact, be more stable. So that's the direction we're going right now as we speak. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about some unpublished work. That's what I prefer always to talk about, because it's better to get some feedback. And this is work that I did with my postdoc, Philip Stanichenko, that is in the audience, and Jason Kopp, that was an undergraduate student in my lab. And this has to do with this idea of nestedness. That goes back almost a century in the era of island biogeography. So you take a checklist, right? Go through all different islands and record which species are on the island. And then we can arrange the islands from the closest to the mainland on the top to the farthest from the mainland. And the species from the most abundant to the least abundant. And what you see is that the island closest to the mainland contains all the species. The next farthest island contains a subset of those that were in the main island. And then you go on, and at the end, in the very far away island, you only contain very few species. And so this idea is like that these species presence is nested like Russian dolls, one inside the other. And so this has been known in island biogeography and has been studied for several decades. But only in the last 10 years, Jordi Bascompte and his collaborators has this idea of doing the same for networks of pollinators and plants. So now we have to switch islands for plants or flowers, right? And the role of the species on the island is taken by pollinators. And you can see that empirical data supports the idea that these also tend to be nested. The most generalist plant interacts with almost all the pollinators. The second most generalist plant interact with the subset of those. Okay. The problem is very difficult, and that's why I never, ever started working on this nestedness. It's for a computational problem, right? All these ways of measuring nested are based on the matrix representation, right? So if you can imagine, you can arrange the same network into very, very many matrices. In fact, if you have P plants and A animals, you have P factorial times A factorial ways of representing these metrics, each of which potentially will give you slightly different results for nestedness, right? So let's say we have 100 plants and 50 animals. That's not even a big network these days. We have 10 to the 222 ways of sorting the metrics. Just to give you an idea, the visible universe has 10 to the 80 atoms. So then what you have to do is either use some computing techniques like heuristics, like genetic algorithms, simulated annealing or whatnot to try to maximize, find a global optimum for this nestedness. Or you could say, well, I sort by column sum and row sums, but then you have the problem of ties. And when there's very many species, you're going to have very many ties, so you go back to the same problem. And then imagine that we have a measure, a good measure. For each matrix, we can say, OK, this matrix has nestedness X. Then we're left to ask, so what? Is it high or is it low for this given number of species and field and whatnot? And this generated a very gory null model war that populated ecological literature for decades. There's entire issues of journals just with people bashing each other on the head for the use of this or that null model. So that's why I just said, you know what, I want to get tenure. I don't want to study this thing. But then, I could not resist the urge. And so like Philip and I started thinking, okay, what is the minimal definition of nestedness, right? So imagine that we have a matrix. We can arrange it if it's nested in such a way that for each coefficient, the one above and the one on the left are greater or equal, right? The nice thing about such a definition is that it works also for quantitative webs, so in which we don't only record which species pollinate which species, but also how many visits each species makes to a particular flower, right? And so then we're saying, okay, but this is exactly the same problem, right? Because we still have to sort the metrics. But now we have a baseline. And the other thing that we said is like, we want something that does not depend on how you sort the metrics. And the first thing that comes to mind is some graph invariant. And the first thing that comes to mind when you think of graph invariance is eigenvalues, right? So we have these metrics. We can do an adjacency matrix for these metrics, and then we can plot the eigenvalues. And now, the simplest thing that you can think is what is the highest eigenvalue, right? The spectral radius, it's called. Turns out there's a beautiful mathematical result that can be slightly improved that says of all possible matrices for a given number of species, plants, for a given number of animals, and a given number of connections between the two, the one with the highest spectral radius of all is a completely nested graph in the sense that I just showed you before. And in fact, all of the possible nested configurations, there could be very, very, very many ways of having a perfectly nested matrix, but they all pile up at the very top of the distribution, which makes it, which begs for a very simple and very powerful statistical way of determining nestedness, right? We just say, what is the probability of finding this spectral radius of above, and we get a p-value. Interestingly, like the perfectly nested configurations, for example, here we have A and C that are perfectly nested, are interdispersed with some that are not exactly nested, but it turns out these are almost nested, right? If you were to move just one link, you would recover a perfectly nested matrix, while those that are very far require very many moves to recover a perfectly nested graph. Fantastic. Moreover, this idea of spectral radiuses works for quantitative data, right? So imagine we have a matrix. We keep the binary structure exactly constant, and we just shuffle the coefficients around, right? So we have the highest possible achievable eigenvalue for this configuration is sure enough perfectly nested in a quantitative sense. Those that are falling in the middle are random, right? Distribution of these coefficients. And those that the very, very low spectral radiuses are anti-nested, right? So things tend to avoid the most generally splanned when we're taking into account quantities, right? So now we can approach the idea of, if we have a visitation network where we have weighted edges saying how many visits did one species make to another species, we can try to come up with a measure of nestedness in this quantitative sense. But this could be obscured by the fact that species have different densities. So imagine that you have a very abundant species. This is bound to have very many interactions, and a rare species is bound to have very few interactions. So we would like to remove this mass action effect, like if these were particles in a jar of gases bumping into each other, then we would expect that the number of visits each one makes to each other would be proportional to the product of their densities. The only data we have, however, is the number of visits j makes to I, and so we can think of this as being a mass action term, xi times y, xj, and the modifier of the mass action that we can imagine being some sort of preference, right? And so what we're going to do is like to fit statistically the best fitting distribution for their densities, and this could be really more than densities. Imagine you have 1 million species, but these flower only for 5 minutes a year. Effectively, you know, there's fewer individuals, right? So this is like some sort of statistical fit to the ideal densities these things should have. And then we can recover this gamma matrix in which 1 says we observe exactly as many visits as we would expect. Lower than 1 would be this is avoided, and greater than 1 is this is a preferred interaction. And so in this case, like a binary matrix that is made of 1s and 0s would be what would happen in a particular case where everything falls exactly from mass action. And so then we took empirical data, we took 52 large data sets, and then we tested for their nestedness in a binary-wise sense and in a quantitative preference-based sense. And when we did the binary, basically all of them but 1 were highly nested, right? So only 2% were non-significantly nested. But then when we did it on the preference, 3 were still nested, 4 were anti-nested, and 46 fell in the middle. So nestedness basically in the preference is not present. This is basically what you would expect at random. And I have 2 lines of argument for this. One, it goes back to this argument of stability we just had before. So imagine that we have a community matrix like that determines the stability of equilibria. And then we can think of this as being a sum of a off-diagonal matrix plus the diagonal matrix, right? So for an off-diagonal matrix, this is going to be the dominant eigenvalue is going to be the spectral radius, right? And so the stability of the whole system depends on the spectral radius of the off-diagonal part plus the diagonal part, right? So if nestedness maximizes the spectral radius, then it follows that nestedness minimizes the probability of stability. So if you have a certain number of coefficients and you want to put them in a matrix, the worst thing you can do is to make it perfectly nested. And interestingly, also here, there's prominent paper saying exactly the opposite. So we went back and saw what was wrong with this thing. And it turns out that, of course, if you have the diagonal that is strong enough, then the structure has no influence whatsoever, right? Because it dominates completely the dynamics. And that's exactly what happens. So in their paper, in fact, nestedness has really no effect whatsoever once you consider it in a quantitative way. The other ecological argument is that if all species were to go for the same flower, they would have a lot of competition. While if they partition things, and so even though like the binary structure is nested, the preferences make it anti-nested or non-nested, then there's less competition and therefore more reward for each species. So just to summarize this tentative conclusion, because the paper is not published yet, so nestedness can be rigorously measured using spectral graph theory. And this is also nice because then we don't have to deal with the problem of scaling, right? Finding the dominant eigenvalue of a system is very easy even for a system as large as the World Wide Web. And then the same definition holds for both binary and quantitative data. And in empirical webs, we find that binary-wise they're nested, but in a preference sense they're not. And this is either because nestedness minimizes stability or because things tend to partition resources in such a way to avoid competition. There's very many more interesting results, even from a mathematical standpoint, how many configuration you can have of nested matrices given a certain number of links and whatnot. And there's a preprint available in case you're interested. And so let me just wrap up thanking the members of my laboratory, people that have been visiting, my collaborators, people that contribute with the discussion on the papers or reviewed or edited the papers, and my funding agencies. And thank you very much for inviting me and for your attention.